was simple enough.
Yeah,
Well, good.
sorry, I turned my volume down. I didn't think about, okay.
No worries. No worries. Great. I'm just looking across the room here. I want to welcome everyone in. Brother David, glad to see that you're able to make it. So he wasn't able to be with us last time because of family reasons and so forth. And others of you that I see here, Brother John Glass, I didn't get to introduce you before, but he's in Poland, serves there. How many years, I'm curious, Brother John Glass, that you've been there? So anyway, we've enjoyed having 21 years. It's awesome. Fantastic. We've enjoyed having him and being part of the class, and of course, each one of you that I introduced last time. So we will be continuing on with Dr. Patterson's second lecture today. This is continuing with the American roots of missions, and particularly, as we're going to see today. So with Adoniram, Judson, and the other missions. Looking forward to what Dr. Patterson has to share with us. And as I'm just glancing across, Brother Zamthan Leon, I believe you prayed for us recently. I'm always happy to have you pray for us. But maybe we'll just continue some variety here. Brother Joseph Ng, I don't know if you're listening. If you are, we'd be happy to hear from you. Or if not, maybe Brother David, maybe you can pray for us to open our class. Okay, either one of you available and ready to pray for us?
Dear God, we thank you for this opportunity to study advanced church history. We ask for your blessing this evening on Dr. Patterson and on each one here. Grant us the wisdom that we need, and we just thank you for this rich heritage of your working through your people over the centuries. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Patterson.
Okay. Well, it's good to be back with you and to be with some of you for the first time, I guess, on this series. And just a reminder that we talked about the history of missions and the British roots in our last class. And the consensus very clearly is that William Carey could be called the father of modern missions. Obviously, missions is God's work. We sow, others water, but God gives the increase, 1 Corinthians 3:6. But it's helpful for us to focus on real people because that's who we are, and they had real challenges, they had real burdens, they had real sicknesses, and frankly, many of them died early, as we'll see today as we talk about some of the other co-workers and friends of Adoniram Judson. So I realize that most of you are not Americans. You're not in America. Brother David just prayed and thanked the Lord for, I believe he mentioned the evening, and it's morning here. So even that reminds us that we are far apart, but with technology we can be brought together. But why would we want to study the American roots of missions? Well, there are some reasons for that, actually. It's not just because I'm an American or Joel is an American, but these people had a burden for the world and ended up going to Asia, both Carey and Judson. And I think Asia is pretty heavily represented here in the student body of this class. So I think you would appreciate these who had a desire to take the gospel to places that were pretty much unreached even 200 years ago. And that's about how far we're going back today as we go to Judson. I ask if you know this man, and the answer you probably would say, now you could make a good guess, right? You understand that this is probably Adoniram Judson, and you would be correct. So I hope you were able to read in the textbook the brief synopsis of his life. I find him an intriguing character, and part of the reason is I've been able to study his life from the place from his birth to his some of his final resting, or not his resting place, but his final places of ministry there in Burma or Myanmar. So we're going to take a relatively fast pace through the information today. There is a good bit of information. So Joel, did you get the PowerPoint, the PDF? Okay. So we can send you this information. The downside to the PDF format is it doesn't have some of the notes to go along with some of the slides. So sorry about that. The real PowerPoint probably could be compressed. And did you get that by Dropbox, Joel? Okay. So anyway, if you want some of the notes, you can hopefully get that somehow from Joel. I'm not sure how that will work. But Adoniram Judson, really a remarkable fellow whose life had God's hand upon it. So let's get started here. And we're going to, just to let you know where we're going, and in the midst of this, we will think about where we're going again and review where we've been. But we're going to basically go from his birth and spend a good bit of time on the background of Judson, even before he left, because it's important not just about his life, but also about the lives of those who went with him, and because mission boards, mission agencies were started. And those agencies, some of them continue to function to this day. And other mission boards have been started in some of your own locations, like in the Philippines and probably in Singapore. And it's nice to have the brother from Poland with us. We plan to visit Poland in a couple of months, so maybe we'll meet you. But we're going to talk about his early life in some detail, because that was what formed his character and gave him his training. And training is very important. You seem to understand that. That's why you're taking this class. You want to be even better trained. So he is considered America's first official foreign missionary. Now, there were other missionaries who went to, let's give an example, they went to minister to the American Indians, but they were not foreign missionaries, and they were not necessarily officially sent. There were some agencies already begun in England, and William Carey was part of one of those. But he was America's first official foreign missionary. The first American Foreign Mission Board was started as a result of Adoniram Judson's, frankly, agitating for it, sort of like William Carey agitating for the Baptist mission. So most of you are familiar with the name Harvard University. Do you know what city Harvard is in? You probably, I hope, some of you said Boston. So you can see Boston on the map here. We're going to discover that this area along the coast is very important for what we're studying today. So you got Boston, and you might notice Cambridge. That's actually where Harvard is. It looks like it's outside of Boston, but it's actually right in the heart. That's Cambridge right there, and that's where Harvard is. Now, Carey did not go to Harvard. We'll talk about why he did not in a few minutes, but I'm going to show you some important locations for, did I say William Carey? Judson did not go to Harvard, but we'll find out where he did go. So we're going to look at his birthplace in Malden, just a little bit outside of Boston. We're going to find that he grew up in his teen years in the city of Plymouth, the town of Plymouth, and that's a famous place that you might have heard of. We'll talk about why. And he went to Brown University for his undergraduate studies. He went to New York City for a short time, and we'll find out why he would want to go to the big city. And I have this one in a different color because Judson was not at Williams College. He never went there as far as I know. But there was something that happened there that greatly impacted him. And so we need to know about Williams College, way out in the west part of Massachusetts in the mountains. It's a small school, but it's considered on an academic level the best of a certain type of small liberal arts college. In rankings, it's number one. But it's not a spiritually minded place at all these days. So we'll talk about that. And then Judson went to seminary in a place called Andover, which is not too far outside of Boston. So we're going to be looking at his upbringing at these places. And so, in one other place, the city of Salem, that's where he was commissioned, and that's where he sailed from when he went to India. Well, America is not known for its long-standing houses and buildings because they weren't made out of stone like you might find in Rome or somewhere around the Mediterranean and other parts of the world. But the house where Judson was born does still stand. It's the oldest house in the town. And now it's just a rental place, pretty run down, but this is what it looks like. And this is the very place where Adoniram Judson was born. And a few years back, you could have seen this plaque on the front yard of the house. It said birthplace of Adoniram Judson. And at one time, that's what the house looked like, a big elm tree in the front. So we've been in that house, and it's, until you really begin to study history, you don't understand the importance of walking where other people walked. But when you actually do that, it really affects you. So we were able to get into this house and into the bedroom where Judson was born. You see it there on the left. The story is, in a nutshell, the house was owned by an Iranian dentist, of all things, a Muslim guy. But he was very kind, and he allowed us to go into his house and into the bedroom, and you can see the steps that Judson would have toddled up as a youngster. By the way, that Iranian dentist was a Muslim, but he had a housekeeper who turns out to be a Christian. So we had a great talk with her. She was from Brazil and a Christian lady, so ironic that we would run into her at that place. But a little bit about his family. His father was a pastor and obviously had a great influence on Judson, but his father was known for his inflexibility, and that was a good thing for the most part. His integrity was impeachable, and he was a serious-minded man, but if he had a weakness, it probably would have been that he was very ambitious for his son. In fact, he told his son at an early age, he said, "Son, someday you will be a great man." And just to jump ahead a bit, Judson was very gifted, and his father really wanted him to take one of the churches in the Boston area and become like a leading figure in the churches of America. He wasn't so happy about the missions focus, at least at first. So in Plymouth, if you were to go to Plymouth today, you could find grave sites of his siblings and a memorial to Judson himself. His mother was one of those who did not like dirt. She liked to keep her house very clean. And Judson himself had that sort of character and aversion to dust and dirt. But the Lord put him in a place where he was in prison, for instance, for a while. We'll talk about that later, but obviously not a clean place. So the Lord had to give him a lot of grace. But keep that in mind that when you think about some of the things that he had to face in the future. All right, so we're going to go to Plymouth, Massachusetts. You may have heard about Plymouth. That is where America started. At least the European Americans arrived there. The Mayflower Pilgrims landed in Plymouth. So if you had been a pilgrim and you had landed in Plymouth, it would have been really just a few hundred yards from this location. You would have come up the hill and you would have seen this hill. Of course, the churches did not exist then, but the Pilgrims were Bible believers and they did establish a church in Plymouth. And the problem is there's a tendency to apostasy in all churches and even in our own hearts, right? We'd have to admit that. So if you went to Plymouth today, this is what you would see. On the left, up on the hill on the top, is a Unitarian church. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But on the right is the church that Judson's father pastored. So he was a pastor in Plymouth, and this is what happened. I'm not sure if you can see the dates. I don't know if you know the dates when the Pilgrims landed. You probably don't. But you can see it on this rock. It's called Plymouth Rock. Sorry, let me get... So just to kind of help you out here, this is a 1. Can you see the 6? And the 2? And the 0. So the Pilgrims landed in 1620. And so there's the Mayflower replica of a ship. And here's where Judson grew up as a teenager. So his dad pastored the church here in Plymouth. But let's talk a little bit more about that church, because this really has a great impact on Judson as he thinks about college. So here is the church. It didn't look like this when the Pilgrims began, but this is what it looks like today. And there's a plaque on the front of it. In 1802, this church, which was founded by the Plymouth settlers, split. And it was a doctrinal split. They were concerned about something. I don't know if you know from your church history what kind of doctrine was permeating New England in the 1800s, early 1800s. So we'll let these men describe it in a plaque on their church. But the conservative group that split formed, which by that time was the Third Congregational Church, and they called the Judson Sr. to be the pastor. So on the church building, you can see this tablet today. It says, this tablet is inscribed in grateful memory of the Pilgrims and of their successors who at the time of the Unitarian controversy in 1801 adhered to the belief of the fathers and on the basis of the original creed and covenant perpetuated at great sacrifice in the Church of the Pilgrimage, the evangelical faith and fellowship of the Church of Scrooby Leyden and the Mayflower, organized in England 1606. That's not easy to understand. Here's what happened. These Pilgrims were Bible believers. Many of them had gathered before in Holland. They went over to England, or they went from England to Holland, and they continued as a church. And when they got to America, they established a church. And some of the early preachers there would have been people like Roger Williams. I'm not sure how many of you are Baptist, but if you are Baptist, Roger Williams is a major player in your history. And I'll talk briefly about him in a few minutes. But he preached in this church back in 1630s. He arrived not too long after the first Pilgrims. The problem is, and this relates to church history, which is the broader subject you're studying in this class. The problem was back then, if you were a Baptist, you might be imprisoned. You might be put in jail. Why would that be? Anybody take a guess why some Baptist men were jailed? Real quick, send a note to Joel and we'll see if anybody gets the right answer. Why would you be baptized? Why would you be put in jail possibly if you were a Baptist back in the Pilgrims' days? Getting any answers, Joel?
Nothing coming in yet.
Okay. Maybe
Okay, here we go. Because they rebaptized believers, nonconformity to the Church of England, doctrinal concern.
Okay. All right, so that first one is exactly correct. But it wasn't that the man himself was guilty for being baptized as a believer, in other words, by immersion. The problem was those kinds of men did not want to baptize their children. And that was basically against the law. You are supposed to baptize your children. So we owe a great debt to Roger Williams. He had to leave the colony because of some of his views, and he went to Providence, Rhode Island. We'll talk more about that. But here's the problem. There was a Unitarian belief spreading throughout New England. It had infected Harvard, essentially denied the deity of Christ. Eventually, the Unitarian Church combined with the Universalist Church, and that's what you might see even in Boston today. So they separated. They wanted a Bible-believing pastor, and they got Adoniram's dad. So his father was not a Baptist. His father was a Congregationalist. But if you wanted to send your son to get a college degree, there weren't too many places back in the 1800s. There were several state universities, but the closest one would have been Harvard. But his dad did not want to send him to Harvard because of the liberalism there and the Unitarianism. Yale was also beginning to be infected, but it was farther away. So his dad decided to send him to Brown University. Well, where is Brown University? I know you men have heard, and I think we have some ladies in this class as well. You've probably heard of the Ivy League, and Harvard and Yale and Princeton are part of the Ivy League, and so is Brown. Brown University was started as a Baptist university. So Adoniram's dad decided to send his son to Brown University. Now, he began university at the age of 16. Think back. Where were you at the age of 16? Maybe you were starting university. It is, I think, technically possible to do that. But probably most of us did not start at 16. So, was this a good idea? By the way, if you go to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, which is not that far from Plymouth, you could see the very hall where Adoniram Judson studied. Back then, it was a small university. There was no Ivy League as such. But he studied in this hall and he lived in this building. But the problem is at Brown, really, and despite his dad's hopes, Judson ended up making a good friend with a guy named Jacob Eames. Eames was a deist. He was a free thinker. He was not a Bible believer. In fact, apparently he was a scoffer of Bible believers. But he and Judson were both very good students, and they became very good friends, and they ended up battling out to see who would have the highest, we would call it today, a GPA. And who do you think won out? Well, Judson beat Ames for the valedictory position, and they became good friends. Judson graduated top of his class. He became a free thinker, and that, in fact, was the topic of his graduation address. The valedictorian got to give that address at graduation. So he did that. We've been to the library and the archives at Brown University, and you can go back and see, if you look at the date, this is from their archives, and you see Judson's name here. I didn't think at the time to get a picture of Eames, but he would be over here on the left because he would be an E instead of a J. So anyway, Judson graduated from Harvard, and he gave his address at the First Baptist Church in America. And you're looking at it on the left bottom there. And I'm standing in the pulpit where Judson would have given his address. It's probably a different pulpit from what he gave, but this is the very location. Brown University, until very recently, held its graduations at this Baptist church, which is really just down the hill from the university. And this is the church that Roger Williams started back in the 1600s. So this is First Baptist Church. This is where Judson graduated. But the problem is he became a deist himself, at least for a time, and his dad was greatly grieved. So Judson graduates. So when you graduate, what do? Well, he went back to Plymouth, and he taught there for about a year. Judson would have been 19 at this time, and he actually wrote 2 textbooks. I think he was teaching math. Not sure what the textbooks were. I think one might have been math, but it might have been grammar. He was skilled really in pretty much every subject, but he was uneasy in his soul. So he made a fateful decision, and one that, even though it had originally a negative impact upon him, eventually brought him to Christ. So he decided to do this. He decided to tour New England, and he also decided to go to New York City, the big metropolis, and find out what the world was like. So it's hard to believe, given his strict upbringing, but for a while, he became an actor, and a rather seedy group of actors it was, according to what he says. It's hard to believe this, but he says, in my early days of wildness, I joined a band of strolling players. We lived a reckless vagabond life, finding lodgings where we could. And this is what really surprises me, and I know this really weighed upon his conscience. We bilked the landlord where we found opportunity. In other words, they would leave without paying. And that was really out of character for the Judson family. And so he's not converted. He's not satisfied. He's very restless. By the way, I mentioned Hunt, page 11. Let me mention 2 books while I'm thinking about it. If you want to find out more about Judson and read more about him, and especially his work in Myanmar and Burma, then there are 2 books that I could recommend. One is this one. That's the one I'm quoting from here in this slide. It's called Bless God, or the Judson History and Legacy. And up here it says, Bless God and Take Courage. And that seems to be pretty much Judson's philosophy. Trust God and go on courageously. If you want a little more detail in some of the areas, and really the classic book about Judson is called To the Golden Shore by Courtney Anderson. So Judson joined this group of actors. He did not stay with them very long. Obviously, his conscience was bothering him. So he's traveling around. He's in New Jersey. He's staying overnight in an inn. And in the room next door to him he hears a man groaning and crying out. And the next morning, he talks to the innkeeper, and he learns that the man in the next room had died. Now, maybe you already know this story, but this is really about as providential as it gets. The man in the next room was his friend, Jacob Eames. And he had no idea that that's who it was. So here's this agnostic who's crying out, obviously maybe not only in physical pain, but probably spiritual pain, and just finding no comfort because he's an agnostic. And so that obviously had an impact on Judson. He was not saved right away, however. So let's just review where we've been and see where we're going. So Judson was born in 1788. I don't know if you remember the dates of William Carey, but Carey was born in the 60s. I believe it was 1761, if I remember correctly. So Carey was a little older than Judson, but they were contemporary, and we'll find out a little bit more about that. By the age of 3, Judson was able to read. By the age of 12, he was capable in Latin and Greek. At the age of 16, he entered Brown University. At the age of 19, he graduated as a valedictorian. And then at the age of 19, he also went off to New York City. At the age of 20, he is accepted into the newly formed Andover Seminary. Now, this seminary, you ready for this? This was the first real graduate school in America and the first real seminary. You say, well, what about Harvard? What about Princeton? What about Yale? Well, those were basically liberal arts colleges or universities. They were not seminaries as we think of them today. The training for pastors then was done in a different way. So here's my question for you. Maybe you can shoot Joel an answer. If this is the first real seminary in America in the 1800s, almost 200 years after the Pilgrims, how were men trained for ministry? A very pertinent question. Brother Joel is teaching at Bob Jones Memorial Bible College, and there are many of you who are familiar with Bob Jones University, and I teach at the seminary at Bob Jones. Is this a brand new thing in the 1800s? If so, how were men trained before that? Shoot Joel an answer if you have a minute. Just take a guess.
First answer that came in their churches.
Okay, anything else? Well, that's the obvious answer, and it's correct with explanation. Basically, it was an apprenticeship model. So they were trained in churches, but it wasn't that they just attended church and did things in the church. The pastors would oversee their training, maybe give them reading to do, obviously give them counsel. And so and maybe train them even in the languages. So this was a new thing. So you might remember Andover Seminary. You don't hear about it today, partly because the name has changed slightly. Now it's called Andover Newton. It linked up with Newton Seminary a number of years back, and it moved to where Newton was. But Judson is not a believer, so why is he accepted into a seminary? Well, I think his dad and others sensed that God was working. So he was accepted, if you look at the next to the bottom selection here, as a special student in the fall of 1808. And in December, on the 2nd of December, he was converted. and apparently immediately dedicated himself to serve the Lord full time, which really every Christian basically does. But he said it, he put it this way: "This day I made a solemn dedication of myself to God." So now he's converted. He's at Andover Seminary. He's beginning to have a real passion for the Lord. And something else is happening. Remember Williams College out in Western Massachusetts? Well, in 1806, a major event occurred, which to the people who experienced it did not consider it major. But looking back on it, it is major. Even today, if you go to Williams College, and as I said, this is not a Christian college at all these days. It's a liberal arts college, very focused on its reputation. It's a small school. Williamstown is a small town. Nothing really impressive about it except the location's beautiful in the mountains. Here's an old picture of what is called Sloan's Meadow, which nowadays would be taken up with some of the buildings of Williams College. But what happened at Sloan's Meadow? Well, something called the Haystack Prayer Meeting happened. And this is a monument to it. Today on Williams College campus, they have a nice little park, and they still honor this occurrence. They have this nice little world on top of a statue here, or a monument. And this is what it says. It's a little bit hard to read, but at the top it says, "The birthplace of American foreign missions, 1806. So this is a couple of years before Adoniram Judson became a believer. So what's happening? Well, these men, Samuel Mills, Richards, Robbins, Loomis, and Green, you've probably not heard of any of those men. The only one that's relatively well known in mission circles is Samuel Mills. But here's what would happen. These men formed a society of the brethren, they called it. Back in those days, in the 1800s, even then, Williams College was not really a Christian school. And the Christians were somewhat scoffed at. So these men met as a society, but sometimes they met secretly. They even used a code for taking their notes. But they would meet and they would pray about foreign missions. So they were out one Saturday afternoon, and they were praying and talking about foreign missions, and a thunderstorm came, and they took shelter under a great big haystack. That's what that represents. That is a very large haystack. You could get under it. This thing here is what I'm talking about, and it had that kind of shape back then. So these men met under that haystack, and they dedicated themselves to become foreign missionaries. So what's the connection with Adoniram Judson? Well, there were some other students at Williams College as well who also wanted to become foreign missionaries. So when you graduate from Williams College and you want to be a foreign missionary, what do? Well, you go to Bob Jones University and study cross-cultural missions, right? Well, some of them learned about Andover Seminary, and some of them attended Andover Seminary. So I think you can kind of guess what happened. Judson met some of these men who already had a passion for foreign missions, and they had dedicated themselves to become foreign missionaries. So what was God doing in his heart? Well, he read a sermon about what God was doing in India. The sermon was "The Star in the East." And his son, who wrote one of the many biographies, we'll see toward the end of the lecture today, there were some back in the day, it's been a while, but even 100 years ago, there probably were 50 biographies written about Adoniram Judson. One of those was by his son, Edward. But in particular, he got to know Samuel Knott, a fellow seminarian, and he was considering the question of taking the gospel to the heathen. He also got to know Samuel Mills, And one man we want to talk about in particular, Luther Rice, some others here, Gordon Hall and James Richards. So his son puts it this way: it was after long meditation and prayer and in communion with the kindred glowing spirits that the thought in Judson's mind of consecrating himself to the foreign missionary work became a fixed purpose. So when Adoniram Judson became fixed in a purpose, it was pretty much impossible to turn him aside. So he wants to be a foreign missionary. So how's that going to happen? Well, as these men began to get together and talk and pray, God is doing a work, but they're not satisfied with the status quo. So they want to go as foreign missionaries. How do you do that? Well, you just get on the ship and take off, right? Well, wisely, they talked to the pastors in the Boston area. And what do you think the pastors were saying? Well, some of them were saying similar things to what Carrie's friends were saying. Not so much the Calvinistic part, although most of these men would have been strongly Calvinistic. They were thinking, we've never done that. We don't know how to do that. Maybe we should let someone else do that. Well, who else could do it? We're talking here, we're getting up to 1808 and then 1810, in that time frame. So who else might be able to send missionaries to the Far East? And that's where most of them are thinking of going. Well, we'll find out. One of the things I'd like to emphasize at this point is the value of having friends who have a passion for missions and for the Lord. Remember his son said, kindred communion with kindred glowing spirits. Kindred glowing spirits. That's what happened. Judson would get together with these men and he would go pray. Now, Andover Seminary has moved, but it began at a place called Phillips Academy. And if you go to Phillips Academy today, and that's what it still is, by the way, it's still a high school, a very elite high school, maybe the most elite high school in America. I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars you would pay to go to this, but some very famous people that you know have attended Phillips Academy. So if you went to Phillips Academy today, even though it's not a Christian place at all, you could go to the very place where Judson and his friends would go pray. It's called Missionary Rock, and you're looking at a picture of it. And I've been there several times, and we always go there and pray when we're there. So a little bit about Phillips Academy. It's an extremely wealthy place, but this is where Judson lived back in the day. And there's a plaque that talks about how this was gifted to Phillips Academy. This is their chapel, beautiful, beautiful location. Just to give you a little hint of some of the people who graduated from Phillips Academy, that Academy stayed in the location. Andover Seminary moved. But can you see this? This tree was from the White House, was planted here by President George Bush, class of 1942. So George Bush Sr. Went to Phillips Academy. George W. Bush attended Phillips Academy. A number of the Kennedys attended Phillips Academy. So after the seminary moved, it continued as a very elite school. But I find it a great blessing to be able to walk there today. And most of the students probably don't even know about this. Back behind one of their dorms is a little lake, a little pond called Rabbit Pond. And this is where, just off to the right there, up in this area, is where Judson and his friends would go pray. So on the plaque it says, Adoniram Judson, Samuel Knott, Samuel Mills, Luther Rice, remember that name? They would go and pray at that location back in 1810. This plaque was put up in 1910, 100 years after Judson was there. So I think it's interesting to look back and find out what happened to these men who had this kind of burden. Maybe you can think back to some of your friends in college, maybe in seminary. Where are they today? Hopefully, they're all still serving the Lord. Some cases, that is maybe not the case. But what about Judson's friends? I find it intriguing that almost all of them were faithful to follow their plan. Not all ended up as foreign missionaries, but some of them did. Here's one. We'll talk about Gordon Hall. His motive was duty is ours, consequences God's. Good statement. So notice what he said when someone offered him an attractive pastorate. And Judson had these same kinds of offers. He said, "No, others will be left who health or pre-engagement requires them to stay at home. I can sleep on the ground, can endure hunger and hardship. God calls me to the heathen. Woe to me if I preach not the gospel to the heathen." So he went to India. He was one of several, along with Judson. They all left about the same time and went to the mission field. He ended up sailing with Luther Rice and Gordon, or forget Knott's first, Samuel Knott, I believe it is, on the Harmony in 1812. So he was faithful. He died in India as a missionary in 1826. What about Samuel Mills? He had been out at Williams College, and he came to Andover. Well, Mills was not actually a foreign missionary, but he had a heart to serve in that way. He did serve as a missionary out to the west. And I have a church in the picture called Old South Church. And this is where Samuel Mills was commissioned. This church is famous because of George Whitefield. Whitefield was not a missionary per se, but he did come to America and he did evangelize, and he died in America at this, just right behind this church in the manse. So he's buried in that church. But the main thing here has to do with Samuel Mills. He was ordained in this church in 1815. So I'm going to put up all the information here and summarize about Mills. Just to give you an example of what America was like back in the 1800s, he went out to New Orleans. He wanted a Bible. He could not purchase one in New Orleans. There wasn't one to be found. So the bottom line is Samuel Mills became a founder of the American Bible Society. And he also was, you can look at this point here, he was a fundraising agent for training black preachers and teachers. And he went over to Liberia America was looking into colonizing parts of Africa, and he died on the return voyage. So he was faithful in ministering to the Lord. Samuel Newell went with Judson to India. He married Judson's wife's good friend. And what we're going to anticipate for the next hour in our next session here is that Newell and Judson were good friends, but there was a difference. It had not happened at this point. Does anybody remember what the difference is or became? Send Joel a quick note if you remember. Samuel Newell was on the same ship with the Judsons, Samuel and his wife, Harriet. They were very good friends. Harriet and Judson's wife were best of friends, but eventually there was a difference. Anybody know what that difference was?
Brother John Glass comments here, baptism.
All right, very good. Yes, we're going to look at that in our next session here in a few minutes. But Judson became a Baptist. These men were Congregationalists, and so that became a difference. But Samuel Newell did end up serving the Lord in India. But what about his wife, Harriet? Very godly girl. You can read her diary. It's amazing how deeply and spiritually discerning she was as a teenager. And she actually died as a teenager. She was the first foreign missionary to die on the field. So, some of her quotations, think about this. How do we feel about these words? The presence of Emmanuel will make a cottage, a foreign land, and savage associates desirable. She said, the gospel bears my spirit up. She says, how sweet was the idea of suffering for Jesus. How sweet to take a decided part in his cause. And she did suffer. In fact, she died very soon after getting to the field. And then she says, oh, who would not sacrifice all that is dear in life to carry the glad tidings of salvation to heathen lands? Well, what's the answer to that question? The answer is most people would not do that, right? Sacrifice what is dear to carry the gospel to heathen lands. There are very few that would do that. Well, as I said, she died very early. She died at 19 before they even got started really in their missions effort. So Samuel Newell has to write a letter back home to her parents, telling them that we just got here, your daughter has passed away. Did he regret going to the mission field? Did Harriet regret going? This is what Samuel wrote to her mother. Tell her that her dear Harriet never repented of any sacrifice she had made for Christ, that on her dying bed she was comforted with the thought of having had it in her heart to do something for the heathen, though God had seen fit to take her away before we entered on our work. So she did not regret going. Her life was, in a sense, a sacrifice, but God used it. And of course, many, many people have come to the Lord as a result of these early missionaries. Okay, one more, and then I think we'll take a break. We need to talk about Luther Rice, very important character. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about him last time. How do we talk about him? Because he was baptized. Anybody remember who baptized him? Well, it wasn't William Carey. It was one of Carey's, as part of the trio there in Sharampur. It was William Ward. And you might remember that we showed a picture of that place in Carey Baptist Church. Well, Luther Rice sailed on a separate ship, but all these folks left about the same time. Why did they go on separate ships? Well, the missionary group of about 5 or 6, 4 or 5 couples, and Luther Rice, who was single, felt that it was wise not for everyone to be on the same ship in case there was a shipwreck. So he went on a separate ship from the Judsons, but on that ship he met some British Baptist missionaries. He was not convinced of the Baptist position. When he got to India, he was sick from hepatitis, and so he took some time while he was sick to do some research. He studied the Greek New Testament, and through that he decided that he was a Baptist. He believed in immersion of believers. So he was immersed by William Ward. Because he had hepatitis, he was sick, they decided to send him back to the States to get treatment, but also to become a representative for the Baptist group or the Baptist missionaries. There was no one to be their spokesman. There was no Baptist mission board in America. So he became the spokesman, and he went all around America preaching and was quite effective. And he raised funds for the Baptist missionaries, who were they at that time? Well, basically Judson and his wife, and then others came as a result. So here's a picture of a book about him. This is the front cover. It's called Luther Rice, Believer in Tomorrow. So when he got back, he helped found a Baptist mission group. He also founded Columbia College. You may have heard of George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He founded that college back in his day, and it went through some very hard times financially, but obviously has continued. It's not a Baptist school now. It's a very secular school at this point. But he made friends with Baptists all across America. One of those is Richard Furman. There's a university here in Greenville, South Carolina, named after Richard Furman. He was a pastor in Charleston and a great supporter of Baptist missions. In fact, you may have heard of the Southern Baptist Convention. He and Luther Rice founded what is called the Triennial Convention. It was a group of Baptists who would meet every 3 years. Eventually, it became the Southern Baptist Convention. They began a little seminary, and it existed for a time here in Greenville, South Carolina, and now it's Southern Seminary. So anyway, Luther Rice was a good friend of Richard Furman's, and he died here in South Carolina. So this is his gravesite, not very far from Greenville here. All right, so we will take a break now, and we will see what happened to these other men, and we will find out about Judson's commissioning and then his ministry in Burma. So 5-minute break, Joel?
Great. I've got 1 minute until the hour, so we'll come back at 4 minutes after the hour.
Excellent.
We'll see you all then. Thank you. Let's continue on with the second half and keep on learning.
All right. Well, let me just review where we've been so far. We talked about Judson's upbringing. His father was a pastor, a Congregationalist pastor. He pastored the church that the Pilgrims started. It was a split, but it was the Bible-believing group. And Judson himself went to Brown University. His dad thought that would be a good place for him to avoid the liberalism of Harvard. Sort of backfired. He was introduced there to deism, but his good friend Jacob Eames died in a room right next to Judson, and Judson didn't know it until the next morning. Then Judson went home. He started a school. Didn't stay there very long, went to New York City, wanted to become a playwright, really just was unsettled. And after he learned about Eames' death, he decided to enroll at Andover Seminary, a new approach to training men. And there he was converted. He met other men who had a heart to serve the Lord as foreign missionaries. And so we're asking the question, what happened to those men? How did they turn out? And thankfully, they all turned out well. We're looking here at a couple more. Samuel Knott, he and his wife, Roxanne, were forced by ill health to return from India, so they did go. We're not totally sure what he did after that, probably had a school in Franklin, Connecticut. But there's a wonderful story in Bless God and Take Courage about Judson's one furlough. I was on the mission field for 17 years, and we had 3 furloughs, I think. Well, Judson had one in his several decades of ministry. And it's interesting that when he came on furlough, he was famous as probably not strong enough. Judson was maybe as well known as the President of the United States in those days. He was an idol of many people. So churches had him come, and he was supposed to preach and tell exotic stories about Myanmar and what God was doing. And he was a bit stubborn, and he would not do that. He would just preach the gospel. So they were not very happy with him. He also had some voice problems during those days. But at any rate, there's one story. He was speaking, I think it was in the Boston area, and this man came walking down the aisle and came up to Judson, and Judson recognized that it was Samuel Knott after all those years. And of course, they hugged each other in quite the scene. So you might want to read about that in Rosalie Hunt's book. So I just mentioned that there are some like Samuel Knott. You've never heard of him probably, but these men were faithful just as much as Judson. They just don't have the name recognition. And so that's where most of us are, right? We're not famous people. We die in obscurity, but that doesn't mean that God isn't watching. And they are just as important as ones like John the Baptist or Adoniram Judson. So Knott was faithful. Okay, so Judson wants to go to the mission field. There's no mission society in America that is set up to send missionaries to the foreign field. So who can send them? I asked this question earlier. If you think about the timing here, think about dates, you might remember that the Baptist Missionary Society in England was established in 1792. So this is 15, 16 years after that. We didn't talk about this, but very soon after the Baptist Missionary Society was started, there was a non-denominational society called the London Missionary Society that began in England. That was in 1795. So there's an option. Maybe the British societies will send these American missionaries. So he wrote to the London Missionary Society to find out a little bit more about how they worked and what they might do. But in the meantime, he was explaining his burden to the congregational churches. And what was their response? Well, at first they said, we can't do it. Then eventually they said, well, let's do this. You go to London and talk with the London Missionary Society and see if they will send you, but allow you to be controlled by the American churches. That sounds very American, doesn't it? And what do you think they said? They said, no. If they're going out under the London Missionary Society, they will be under our jurisdiction. So Judson came back. There's a long story, a fascinating story actually about Judson's trip over there. You might have read this somewhere in your reading. But he was taken captive. And he wasn't sure he would be released. There was there were bad feelings between Britain and France back in those days, and even America. So he was taken captive, and it was a French frigate, as I recall. He didn't speak French at that time, but some doctor overheard him using Latin. So the doctor befriended him and pointed out that Judson was not British and he was not French. And so anyway, eventually he was released and he was able to meet with the London people. But he came back to America and said, look, we need to do this ourselves. But if you don't want to do it, if you don't want to start a mission agency, then we will go under the London Missionary Society. And so in the end, the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, ABCFM, was begun, and they agreed to send them to the mission field. So that location is not too far out of Boston. There is a plaque commemorating the beginning of this American Foreign Mission Board. The American Board, what a name. Look at this name. Gospel Fellowship Association is the mission I work for, and it's easier to remember. This one is the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, was organized June 29, 1810 in the church that stood here. It has carried the gospel into many lands and ministered to millions through churches, schools, and hospitals. So Judson, we've been talking about, but we haven't talked about any women. But the wife is at least 50% of the equation if you're married. And some of you are, and you know what I'm talking about. So was Judson married? The answer is yes. Very soon after his commissioning, actually before his commissioning, he was married, but just a few days before. And the woman he married, you can see it on the sign there, Anne Hazelton Judson. Her married name, her maiden name was Hazeltine. So that house also still stands. This is where she grew up. And on the back side of it, you see an extension. That was made for her and her friends to have dances and that sort of thing. It was really for enjoying society. Even though her dad was probably a believer, they were very much into enjoying society and balls and dances and that sort of thing before Anne was converted. Once she was converted, she became very serious. Well, Judson met her in that house right there in that room right there. He first saw Anne and was struck from the very beginning. And so Judson didn't mess around. He talked to her father, he talked to her, and wanted to get married. But he was honest. Listen to this letter that he wrote to her father. And he wrote it, not because he was at a distance, but just to show his seriousness and propriety. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring. Now notice this, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to see her departure to a heathen land and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India. He was planning to go to India at that point. To every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Whoa! What if you're a father, you get a letter like this, a man wanting to marry your daughter, and he says, well, she may die a violent death. Are you willing to send her to that? Can you consent to all of this for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness, brightened by the acclamations of praise, which shall redound to her Savior from heathen saved through her means from eternal woe and despair? That was his letter to her father. Amazingly, her father agreed. Well, actually, her father said, well, we'll leave it up to Anne. And Anne was also called Nancy. It was kind of her nickname, I guess. So if you run across Nancy Judson, then that's the same as Anne Judson. So Anne was well trained herself. By the way, I wanted to make this point. I commend you for trying to get more training. That's why you're taking this class. I don't know if you've noticed, but the people we've talked about, I think almost without exception, have gotten good training. Even going back to William Carey, he was not trained in a seminary as such, but he was well trained personally on his own studies and also by some of the other men. You talk about Roger Williams. I didn't mention this, but Roger Williams, like John Eliot, you might remember that name. We talked about him as a missionary to the Indians around the Boston area. Both of those men were Cambridge graduates. We've talked about Judson. We talked about Luther Rice. These men got good training. Anne Judson, she was well trained. She went to a school just down the road from her house, really just a few blocks, and this is what it looks like today. Now it's a Bible college. Back in her day, it was called Bradford College. And when we go there on tours, we have a lady who pretends to be Anne Judson, and she gives a lecture about Anne's training there. And there's a hall named after Anne's sister who also taught there. Well, Judson is ready to go. He's found a wife, he's married, and he's ready to go. When I say ready to go, I mean ready within days, weeks to depart after he gets married. So they're in the town of Salem. There's a church that was started back in Pilgrim's days, back in the 1620s. Roger Williams preached at this church. Now it's called Tabernacle Congregational Church. It's in the town of Salem. You may not know history of America, but there were witch trials back in the day. And this town is famous for its witch trials. You can see they made a lot of it for tourists. You see in the top, in this area here, Salem Witch Museum. So this is the church that still exists. It's super apostate, if I could put it that way. I was reading their website last night. They're a very affirming church, which means they totally accept homosexual people as members. They just are very open and affirming is the terminology they use. They've been very nice to us, and we've been there several times because in that church, you can see a picture of it on the right there, is a history room. And it helps recall the day. And this would have been quite a scene to be in this church back in 1810, 1812, I guess it was. And there was this commissioning service for those 5 men that we talked about. And in this service, toward the end, when they're getting ready to pray for the men, Ann Judson gets, Ann Hazeltine, well, no, at this point she's Ann Judson because they'd been married the day before. She gets out of her seat and she goes up and she kneels beside the men. This is sort of out of protocol, but she kneels there dedicating herself as well. So this commissioning service happened in this church. It looked a little different back then, but it probably was even bigger back then as far as accommodating hundreds of people. So in the front left is a history room, and in that room is this bench that Judson and his men were sitting on. You see them in the picture getting their commissioning, hands laid upon them. They were sitting on this bench, and that bench still exists. My wife and I have sat there several times. So Judson, when he was back on that one furlough, sat on that bench again. It's been preserved since that time. So, special place. We were in a lecture about Judson. This lady gave a lecture. This is inside the church. Nice lady. They don't seem to be opposed to Judson, but they don't seem to share his faith either. So just behind the church, you're near the water, and this is where Judson and his group sailed in 1812. I mentioned there were 2 groups. One group sailed from Philadelphia, and Judson and the Newells sailed from Salem on a ship very much like that one. Another idea of what the ship would have looked like. So where did they go? Well, all they needed to do was to go to India. As it turns out, Judson had a burden for Burma, but he had no idea he could get into Burma, so they went to India and they went to Calcutta. If you remember, Calcutta is up in this area of India. So they went to Calcutta. The problem is they were not welcomed in Calcutta. So they went to the Isle of France. It's called Mauritius. And that's where Harriet Newell died. And from there, Harriet's husband, went up to Bombay. I don't show that on the map, but Bombay is over on this side of India, right in here, if you can see where I'm pointing. So he went there, but Judson did not go there. So what had happened is when Judson got to Calcutta, you might remember that he became a Baptist. He had studied on the trip over on the ship. He had begun to really think about baptism and what it means and what the New Testament taught. And he became a convinced Baptist, believers baptism by immersion. And so from there, they did go to Burma, and we'll get there in just a minute. So a little review. Born 1788 to a pastor, a Congregationalist pastor. 1807, went to New York, disappointed, convicted, and he was changed, converted in December of 1808. 1812, they arrive in India. and he and Anne are baptized by William Ward, but they're not allowed into India, so they have a choice. They can either go back, they can go to India or go back to England, sail back to England and then back to America, or they can go to Burma. They've had a baby die, and they have a choice. And of course, you can guess that their choice was to go to Burma. But that was not the advice they got. We'll get to that advice in just a minute. So let's think about what happens. You're sent out by the first mission agency in America for foreign missions, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. They send him out. They are a congregational group. They practice infant baptism. Carrie becomes a convinced Baptist. What happens at that point? Well, Carrie, I'm sorry. If I say Carrie, think Judson today, okay? Now and then it slips out. Judson has to be righteous, so he obviously tells the mission agency that he agitated to have start. He tells them that he's now a convinced Baptist. They're not happy. They're not going to support such a person. So Judson needs support. What's going to happen? We'll think back. We've already talked about this a bit. How is he going to get support? Well, you might remember Luther Rice. Luther Rice from Calcutta went back to America specifically to begin to raise funds for the Judsons, essentially, at this point. The Congregationalists are going to drop him. So he writes a letter to the American Baptists and urges them to help. And so there is a First Baptist Church in Salem. Now, this church has since been condemned as far as the building, but back in 2007, when this picture was taken, First Baptist Church of Salem still functioned in that building. And one of the major supporters was a guy named Lucius Bowles. You'll see that name here in the second point. He was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Salem, and he led the Baptists in that area to begin to support the Judsons. Now, just going back to just remind you, this is Carey Baptist Church in Calcutta. This is where Judson met William Carey and also Luther Rice, and this is where they were baptized, in that very place. So this is what Judson writes back to the board, the congregational board. My change of sentiments on the subject of baptism is considered by my missionary brethren as incompatible with my continuing as their fellow laborer in the mission which they contemplate. The board will undoubtedly feel as unwilling, excuse me here, I gotta move something so I can see, as unwilling to support a Baptist missionary as I feel to comply with their instructions, which particularly direct us to baptize credible believers with their households. So, he doesn't fit the congregational model anymore regarding baptism. So this is what he says: I have now the prospect before me of going alone to some distant island, unconnected with any society at present. And remember, he's not going to be allowed into India. So he's not sure at this point where he's going. Unconnected with any society at present existing from which I might be furnished with pecuniary support. Whether the Baptist churches in America will compassionate my situation, we don't usually use that word that way, but you understand what he's saying. I know not. I don't know if you'll have any sympathy for me or not. I hope that while my friends condemn what they deem a departure from the truth, they will at least pity and pray for me. So what kind of attitude does that show? Excuse me. Well, I appreciate the humility that shows. He doesn't attack their position. He admits that this is a disappointment to them, and he admits that they have a different perspective, and they might consider it error, but he presents it, I think, in a very humble way. So it's decision time, and I said that they're not encouraged to go to Burma. At this time, there's really not much going on in Burma at all. If you remember William Carey and have read much about him, you might remember that he had a son named Felix. Felix has gone to Burma. Felix is living in Burma at this time. So there is a possibility of Burma, and that's actually what they decide. But this is what Anne told some of her friends. She was told by friends in Madras not to go to Burma, but to think of the difficulties and her health needs. This is what she says. The poor Burmans are entirely destitute of those consolations and joys which constitute our happiness. And why should we be unwilling to part with a few fleeting, inconsiderable comforts for the sake of making them sharers with us in joys exalted as heaven, durable as eternity? So what's her decision? Well, her decision really, I think, had been made earlier. Remember when she went up and prayed with the men? Dedication. She wasn't turning back. Some had accused her earlier of being willing to go to the mission field because she wanted to be with Adoniram. No doubt she did want to be with Adoniram. But these statements and the actions afterward indicate that she too was a missionary at heart and really set a wonderful example for missionary wives. So I'll say something about this later, but let me just mention it while I'm thinking about it. Judson had 3 wives, and just like William Carey, and all of them were godly women and are worth studying. In fact, there's a book called The 3 Judsons, The 3 Mrs. Judsons, I'm sorry. And so I would advise you to read that, especially if you're married, to suggest it to your wife. So they're determined to go to Burma, and this is what they see. Hasn't changed probably a whole lot since those days. Burma in those days was, in some ways, probably more prosperous than it is now. Not that it was prosperous back then, but it did have an emperor and had some pretty elaborate buildings, especially temples. And this is the main temple in the country. This is what you see when you come into what's called Yangon now, but Rangoon back in those days. So if you're a missionary, pretty depressing sight to come up river and see something like that. This is what you know you're going to be facing. So these pictures were taken in the rain. I was able to visit a few years ago, and when we were there, by the way, just to show that even though it looks ornate, it looks very valuable, not all of this is gold. There's some gold platedness, but this is what a lot of the country looks like. So these days, there are lots of impoverished areas. So the day we were there, it was very hot. And to get into the temple, you have to walk barefoot. So you can imagine with the sun beating down, we had to walk on that red carpet with bare feet. And frankly, that hurt. We would try to find little bits of shade. You can see a little shade off there to the right. We would run off to these other places where we could be in the shade now and then. And the red was hotter even than some of the marble. But this is a big temple complex, Shui Dagon in Rangoon, and this is what Judson was facing. Well, as you think about mission strategy, you have to think about contextualizing the message in the right sense of that term. You have to think of ways that fit their culture. So Judson began by, a fairly Western way of thinking, let's have a little group, let's have a church, let's have a meeting. But then he began to study how the Burmese met. And he noticed that the Buddhists in particular would have little rest stops along the paths, along the roads, where they could come in, maybe get some tea, they could sit down, they could just chat, get out of the sun, get in the shade. And so Judson decided to have a zayat. And this became an extremely fruitful means of missionary activity, but it fits their culture. And so they began to see some converts finally after several years, 1819. So that's about 7 years or 6 years after their arrival. And the difficulty in those days was the country had an emperor or king, and the king controls everything. If you go to the emperor, called the Golden Feet, if he doesn't like what you're doing, he might have you sent away. He may have you killed. He may forbid you to preach and teach. And that was partly the case in Burma in those days. The emperor was Buddhist. He wanted his country to be Buddhist. He was not interested in Christianity. But Judson needed to go to see the emperor a couple of times. One time he went with another missionary, and the first visit was not well received. 1819, they went to visit with the emperor and in a city called Ava, and you can see the ruins of that city here on the right. But there was a more successful visit 4 years later, and the emperor at that time learned that there had been a few converts to Christianity. So this is in a sense, that's dangerous information. He could forbid all Christian activity. He could get rid of Judson if he wants to. But something else is happening at this time, and that is conflict with England. So in 1824, there's conflict with England, and the Burmese government decides to imprison basically all foreigners, assuming that they are British. They didn't really ask a lot of questions. So Judson is imprisoned along with other, with British people. And so this is a miserable experience. Remember I said he did not like dirt. He did not like uncleanness. He liked everything to be done neatly and in order. But he has no control. And he is abused, as are many others, and many die in this prison. His wife bribes and figures other ways to try to sneak food into her husband and basically keeps him alive. At nighttime, they would face what must be a miserable experience. You can see they are hung upside down. In that picture, you can see that they're not totally off the ground. It's their back and their neck are left on the ground. And that's the way they're treated during the night. And then they are marched, a little later they were marched through the heat, and others died along the way. But somehow Judson makes it through this. And in the end, he is used as an interpreter. But in the end, it also wore out his wife, and she died. So here he is. He's suffered all of that. And now to top it off, his wife, his dear wife, Anne or Nancy, dies. So he begins to grieve. And as the days and weeks and months pass, he eventually gets to the point where his grief almost takes him over the edge. He goes out into the jungle. He sets up a little place beside her grave, and he lives in the jungle alone for 40 days. People are obviously quite concerned about him. Why would you be concerned about him? Well, think back about what's her name? What's William Carey's wife's name? Remember? Dorothy Plackett was her maiden name. And what happened to Dorothy when, when the stresses of missionary life began to take their toll? Well, she lost it. She became insane. And Judson's friends are concerned. You know, maybe this is happening to him. I mean, this is not normal to go live alone in the jungle. And by the way, in the jungle, you are susceptible to attack by lions and other things. I mean, you could easily be killed. But thankfully, Judson came out of that depression. By the way, here's a picture. I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but I had to blow it up a bit. You might recognize some people. Some of you will know Ping. He's right here, pastor there in Singapore. Here's Chris Seawright, missionary over in Cambodia. Probably some others. Some of you, this is Brother Kam, I believe, from Myanmar. I'm not sure of some of the others. But anyway, this is a monument to Ann Judson in Myanmar. So Judson finally comes out of his melancholy. And the people there just really, by this time, greatly admire him. He has given himself not only to preaching and teaching, but to Bible translation. And I'll say a little bit more about this, but you see a picture of his translation of the Bible, the entire Bible, into the Burmese language. And again, let me just make this application. Judson was well trained. Now, God can use us, you know, regardless of the training, because we have various opportunities. But I just want to make a point that any training you get can be used for God, and Judson used his to the utmost. His Bible translation is outstanding. I'll say a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. So he finished that translation in 1834, which would be, what, 21 years after his arrival. So he was not, he was in a hurry, but he took his time, if you know what I mean. He wanted to do it right. But he's alone. He has children. What's he going to do? Well, you probably can guess. He married a girl named Sarah Boardman. Who is Sarah Boardman? Well, she had gone as a missionary with the Congregational Board, and she had married a guy named George Dana Boardman, and he had died in 1831. Well, Sarah Boardman, rather than go back to America, decided she would stay in Burma, even though she's a widow, and she would not be faulted for going back to the States with her kids. She decided to stay. And she knows Judson. She admires him, and he admires her, especially for her skills and for her godly walk with the Lord and for her staying on the field. So they married, and they had a number of children. In fact, she had, I believe it was 8 in like 10 or 11 years. Don't quote me on that one, but it was a number of children in a short time, and really just kind of wore herself out. And she died on a return. Well, she died on the way back to America, and that's when he had his one furlough. He returned to America. Notice the date, 1845. And I won't go into this, but America is facing a lot of conflict over the issue of slavery in those days. But as I mentioned, on his furlough, He refused to give stories. He did not want people, he despised the thought that he was like, like a circus actor. People came for the show. He did not like that. Excuse me 1 second. I need to get, sorry, I need to get my charger for my, so he would not give those kind of stories. He would just preach the gospel. And there's a sample of his Burmese Bible. Well, Sarah Boardman died. He's alone again. While he's in America, he learns and meets a girl named, her real name is Emily Chubbuck. She is much younger than he, about half his age, but he's intrigued by her. He appreciates her desire. At a young age, she had wanted to become a missionary, but at this point, she's a writer of fiction. So he wonders, okay, why don't you use your skills to write something besides fiction? He was not critical of her, but he challenged her to use her skills in other ways. But he also decided that she would be a great wife. Now, she was concerned. As I mentioned, Adoniram Judson is very well known in America, and almost a household name. And some people thought, okay, that's not too good. She's half his age. Why is he going to marry her? And she was concerned about what people thought. Judson, at this point, is way beyond that. He is not at all concerned. He thinks she'd be a great wife, so he marries her. And she is very willing to be a missionary, and so they go back to Burma. And she learns the language. She becomes a very good mother to children. And she herself becomes a good missionary. So I mentioned here that he finished the English-Burmese dictionary. So there are two things in the area of literature that we need to note about Judson. William Carey was an excellent Bible translator. However, maybe because of the fact that he was trying to do a lot of translations, many of the ones that he did, and he knew this, needed to be revised over time. What is amazing about Judson's translation is that it's still in use. Now, I mentioned here, I've got a statement about that, so let me just show you this. Judson died in 1850, so now we're going to kind of recap some things about his life. I'm always interested in a person's last words. Judson's were, "It is done. I am going." So that's a nice way to end your life. You've finished your course. Sounds scriptural, doesn't it? I finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there was laid up for me a crown of righteousness. So Judson reached his golden shore, and that is taken from, that concept is taken from the title of the book, To the Golden Shore. So a few quotations that illustrate his focused life. For instance, the University of Brown wanted to give him an honorary doctorate. Now, I don't know if you would agree with this, but this was his position. He was just not interested in human accolades. I think maybe early in his life, he was a proud fellow. And it seems that over time, God just really gave him great humility. At any rate, this is what he said to them. "I beg to be allowed the privilege of requesting my correspondents and friends through the medium of your magazine no longer to apply to my name the title, Doctor, which was conferred on me in the 1823 operation of Brown University, in which, with all deference and respect for that honorable body, I hereby resign. I am now convinced that the commands of Christ and the general spirit of the gospel are paramount to all prudential considerations. So he just didn't feel it appropriate to be called Dr. Adoniram Judson. Some other quotes that indicate something about him and his life. See how you like this one. I have seen so much of the trials and responsibility of missionary labors that I am unwilling to urge anyone to assume them. What does he mean by that? He means the urging must come from a higher source. In other words, I'm not going to try to talk anyone into being a missionary. God has to put that on their heart. Maybe something that really captures his thinking would be the next one. The motto of every missionary, whether preacher, printer, or schoolmaster, ought to be devoted for life. Then he says, death will never take me by surprise. Do not be afraid of that. I feel so strong in Christ. He has not led me so tenderly thus far to forsake me at the very gate of heaven. No. I am willing to live a few years longer if it should be so ordered. If otherwise, I am willing and glad to die now. I leave myself entirely in the hands of God to be disposed of according to his holy will. So what were the effects of his life? Just thinking back on it now, kind of summarizing. In 1853, a biography, this was not too long after his death, by Francis Whalen had sold 26,000 copies in the first year. The most famous biography of Anne appeared in a new edition almost every year for 26 years. As I said, these people were well known. If you'd lived in America back then, you would have known them. To date, there have been 56 biographies of Adoniram and at least 16 of Anne. There's an issue of Christian History magazine that gives a lot of information about them if you're interested in pursuing that one. Now, here's a very important point. The ongoing fruit today in Myanmar among Baptists is another effect of their lives. On the side of the prison where he suffered is now Judson Baptist Church. Now, I was reading some last night about Baptist, and the source I was reading indicated that I think Myanmar is about third or fourth in the world for Baptists. It might be behind Philippines now. But in Operation World, I think America has the most Baptists, and then maybe India, and then Myanmar. And you know, Myanmar is a very Buddhist country, but there are a lot of Baptists there. And some of you, is anyone in the group from Myanmar? Joel, do you know?
Yes, sir. Actually two, and
Okay.
Brother Zemtan Lian, he's been putting some really interesting insights or just feedback as you're going along, very personal, direct, connected right to some of the things you're covering. So I'll send this chat to you. You might enjoy just reading through some of the comments and feedback and interaction he's giving with some of the points you're making. It's good.
Okay. Does any of it fit right now? Would it be appropriate for you to read that now, or I don't know, whatever you think?
Just, earlier someone was asking about the translation that you mentioned, and someone was asking, so is that still in use and so forth? And his comment here, I wonder how could he, the Westerner, pick up all these concepts and ideas in complex Burmese? It's really the work of the Holy Spirit. For me, I think and rethink again, how could Judson have learned to put all those words together into a book? It's pretty neat.
Well, it just shows Judson's determination to put himself into their mind, into their mindset.
He comments here.
I do have a comment about that translation a little bit here in just a minute, but it just shows his determination to understand them. And apparently he did it very well because of what I'll show you in just a minute. Okay.
Brother Semtan Leon also follow up here today. If I don't understand a concept in English, I'll look back at Judson's translation. It really helps with the understanding. It's good.
Really? That is amazing, isn't it? Wow. his translation, I say here, is still used. And that Bible I showed you is in the Angus Library of Regent's Park College in Oxford. But I didn't know this until last night. I'm sorry. Let's see. Maybe it's in my notes here. Let me just look and see. Let me close that out a second here. I put it somewhere. I'm not finding it right now. But last night when I was reading about this this translation, I can tell you what I read. It said that a few years ago, I'm not sure how many years ago, there was a committee formed to consider updating the Burmese Bible. The committee met, they looked at it, they went over Judson's translation, and they decided to disband. They decided not to try to make any kind of revision. So it's still, as far as I know, and this brother seems to be confirming this, as far as I know, this is still the Burmese translation used. Is that right?
That was the comment he made in the chat earlier. Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's very helpful. So, you know, you have to admire the diligence of this. By the way, I also mentioned that he did a dictionary. And this brother mentioned like understanding and like grammar. Apparently, Judson's dictionary and grammar has been sort of a standard down through the years as well. So he obviously understood the language through and through. So some key components of his character as we think about that, he was insistent upon obeying God's calling regardless of opposition. You see it really from the very beginning. He wanted to go to the field. He was going to go with the London Missionary Society if America wouldn't send him. He became convinced of the Baptist position. He followed that. So then secondly, I've mentioned this, but he used his talents and training fully for the Lord. He obviously was a gifted linguist, but on the other hand, he would spend 12 hours a day sometimes translating. He worked at it. He was innovative in evangelism. He wasn't just an ivory tower intellectual. He was an evangelist. He used a zayat. And I like to point out that he had a wonderful testimony in his family. He had 3 exceptional, godly, dedicated wives, and they all seemed to really revered him. So the 3 Mrs. Judsons are Anne Hazeltine, Sarah Boardman. I don't have a picture of her. I'm sure there's maybe a painting somewhere, and Emily Chubbuck, who was also called Fanny Forrester. So I have some pictures of Burma today. Some of these I got from Dr. Kevin Oberlin. I have not traveled extensively in Burma, but these are some of the pictures I got from him. You might just want to see that still a very Buddhist country. And my understanding, the Buddhist monks, this is one of the churches. That's where they were meeting. I have some pictures of places in Yangon, but I don't have them here. Let me just close with this, and if there are any questions. We've studied William Carey. We've studied Adoniram Judson. And it's important to remember God's exhortation in Hebrews. Remember those who led you, who spoke the word of God to you. And considering the result of their conduct, imitate their faith. So we looked at William Carey, and today we studied Adoniram Judson. Okay, any comments, questions? Looks like we've got 2 minutes or more if we need it, I guess. All right. Well, I will send this PowerPoint to you, Joel, and If any brother or sister from Myanmar has a final comment, I'd be very pleased to hear that. I was going to say this about Myanmar. This is my understanding. When I was there, this came out pretty clearly that a lot of the fruit in Burma, if I can use, I'll say Myanmar. That's what it's called today. A lot of the fruit is more up in the northern area in the tribal sections, and the more Burmese, if I could use it that word, not the tribal people, have been harder to reach and have been fairly neglected because of that. So I know one of our missionaries in Cambodia, Brother Faris McPhail, is quite burdened for the Burmese people that are more, I guess, toward the south. And I've heard that there is going to be a team from Grace Dental Mission going down there to help some of the works there. So I'm excited about that.
Very neat. Comment that someone made here. Are there descendants of Judson today in the U.S.?
I would assume so. I don't know for sure, but in this book, the Judson history, and if you see the last word, legacy, there's several chapters about the legacy, and it talks about their children. I don't know that it traces them up to the current day, but I feel certain with, his connections there with 3 different families and children by all those ladies that there would be, but I'm not sure.
Okay, Dr. Patterson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
2 very good, very helpful lectures, and one more coming up on July 23rd. And we're looking forward to hearing from you again, the student volunteer movement. Thank you. Thank you for all the work that's here and also the experience and the time pulling all of these things together.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Just a comment here before we go. Next time we'll be with Dr. Brian Collins, and this is talking about medieval Christianity. He's given us some readings, some fairly extensive readings. So I would say go ahead and start with them pretty soon. And you're going to be reading some different works by Aquinas, who certainly has an oversized influence during that time. So definitely take a look at those readings, be ready for that. We've had Dr. Collins before, and he will give us a lot of content. So being prepared and reading ahead will help us just absorb that content. Thank you again to all, especially to Dr. Patterson, and we will look forward to seeing you, Dr. in a few weeks, and everyone else will look forward to seeing you on Monday night. Thank you.
Okay.